Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised. Everything in Scott Scurlock's life had brought him to this moment. Thursday, June 25th, 1992. He'd watched the movie Point Break over and over again. And now, it was his turn. "Let's go," he whisper-hissed to his partner in crime, Mark Biggins. On that historic day, Scott Scurlock's first Seattle bank robbery.
Because the thrill will wear off over time. And so if you just repeat it, just like your favorite meal, you're not going to get the same taste from it. So it would make sense that he's going back for a repeat thrill and ramping it up more and more, bigger and bigger each time.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Brandon. You're listening to episode 180, Hollywood, part 5, Whetted Appetite. You may recall in a previous episode how Scott had perfected the art of attracting women to his treehouse lair, a getaway he called Seven Cedars, and he did this by using a mix of machismo, charisma, and chiseled good looks.
He had really nice facial structure. He did a lot of yoga and things like that, so his body was kind of lithe and chiseled. And he had a nice smile. He was definitely attractive. He had it going on. He had a nice smile. He was very affable, easygoing, very easy to talk to. Made you feel special. He had that kind of quality to him.
But Scott also worked his magic, his mesmerizing Bodhi-esque riz, so like the character in Point Break he aspired to be. He used his powers of persuasion to attract his own personal band of Bodites, which he referred to as his tribe. Basically, these were bromances he built on trust and loyalty over time. A carefully curated ensemble of friends, which included Mark Biggins. Now, in the 1970s, Mark was a struggling college student.
Then went back down to St. Cloud University. That was in 1973, the fall of 73, and up until the spring of 74. And he was actually studying pre-med.
I think that's one of the interesting things about these guys is that they've all got their own backstory of not just what you would expect,
right?
Or whatever people might expect a bank robber to be.
Yeah, you make assumptions about who's, people that would rob a bank, but in fact, these guys weren't typical of that.
That's retired supervisory special agent Sean Johnson from the FBI. And in the late 1970s, Sean says that Mark had made his way to Olympia and Evergreen College. Now, if you'll recall, it was at Evergreen College where Scott, a pre-med student himself, had started making a lot of money selling drugs.
But at the time, I think pretty much, I guess Scott was, selling crystal meth and marijuana and using too.
Oh, he was using both of those?
Yeah, and selling.
Okay. And that's another thing that I've read and talked to people where he was really interested in having his body as like a physical temple, and he always really made sure that he took great care of his body. Well, but it sounds like he was doing drugs.
Yeah, he was. So yeah, he was both selling and using as far as I'm concerned.
Scott and Mark were introduced at Evergreen College by a friend. At the time, Mark was an English literature major.
Actually, he met Scott at Evergreen College in about 80 or 81 through a mutual friend of theirs, and was at that point, a mutual friend was living at Scott's house. So Scott was studying chemistry at that time at Evergreen. So he and Scott, were acquaintances basically through about 1980 to 84, knew each other from a mutual friend through school. That was the extent of the relationship at that point in time. Back in the early 90s, when he got involved with Scott and Scott's, plans to do the bank robberies. But at that point in time, they were just mutual friends.
Yeah, I think that part of the mystique of Scott is that, he just had this magnanimous personality. But it sounds like he didn't turn on the charm at that point. They were just like acquaintances.
No, and for both Steve and Mark, I don't think Scott turned the charm on until he needed them for something.
Interesting. Okay.
Kind of developing that relationship, building rapport with these folks and trying to get to a point where he could ask them for a favor.
We'll get to Steve, a future accomplice. But for now, let's unpack what Sean said there. He said, basically, Scott had to get to the point where he could ask a favor. Because when it came to his inner circle of friends, Scott played the long game. He would help them out of financial jams with money from his drug sales. He also invited them out to his treehouse to live with him, where they would party and bro out on collective building projects. And of course, wining and dining his friends at all those expensive restaurants in town where Scott's favorite champagne of choice was pretty much always kept on ice, waiting for him.
It was super easy to wait on, very friendly. He was always coming back from some trip, some excursion, or so, he'd talk to me about where he'd been and his travels, and we always got a champagne. Sometimes he'd want you to open it, but most of the time he just wants you to put it on the table. So he would actually do all the work, and then he'd slip you a crisp $100 bill every time. So everybody wanted to wait on Scott and his friends because he was so generous.
Scott's friends would worship him. Basically, they'd do almost anything that he asked.
Did you find that in all of the people that you spoke to, that he was always kind of collecting people and then, doing favors for them, and then he would call in those favors?
Right.
Did you find, how would you describe that from your own lens?
Well, he was very manipulative, for sure. I don't know, again, not ever met him or talked to him. Just his personality would be very charismatic and I think manipulative. I'm not sure if he was borderline sociopath. I mean, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist. I can't speak to that. I'm not gonna make that assumption, but definitely he knew how to work people into his relationship and into their vulnerabilities, I guess, the best way to describe it, and utilize those vulnerabilities to help him out. That's my perception of it.
Another thing, Scott emulated his anti-hero hero, Bodhi from Point Break. If you'll recall, Bodhi is actually short for Bodhisattva, a Buddhist term for an enlightened being who is so generous that they delay their own entry into nirvana to help others achieve it. The word Bodhi means awakening or enlightenment. And Scott Scurlock certainly appeared to emulate to his friends that he was worthy of their worship.
As far as Mark's concerned, I think he just got pulled in a situation that he wasn't prepared for. And I think he was reluctant throughout the robberies he was in to actually help, but felt some obligation to give some loyalty towards Scott.
In 1987, Mark Biggins was going through a brutal divorce. He was struggling, and Scott was there to help him pick up the pieces.
After he got divorced, guess what? Scurlock called him and asked him to move back up to Washington. And at that point in time, like I said, Scott knows at some point that they're susceptible or receptive to help or assistance, and he took advantage of that to invite Mark back up to Olympia.
And when Mark moved back up to Olympia to help him out, was it to help him with his treehouse, or did he say what he wanted him to come back for?
Well, this is now when he moved in '87. He was living the treehouse was already pretty much built, I guess. So he was living in the treehouse. Mark was at the time. And he and Scott went into business together at that point in time. And they had a company called Seven Cedars Construction. And that's what he called his treehouse, was Seven Cedars.
But they actually had a business.
Allegedly. I don't know what they did, what they constructed, but there was a business, Seven Cedars Construction.
It sounds like the construction company could have been a front for his meth operation.
I guess it was kind of a front, like, what do you do for a living while I'm working construction? I don't know. I mean...
So that's your take on it?
Yeah, that's my take on it. They did some work, I guess, because Scott was paying Mark about $1,000 a month to work on his property, Scott's property there, and kind of watch the house when Scott was gone on trips. Apparently during that time, Scott was traveling quite frequently. He went, I guess when Mark was living there, Scott had taken a trip to Florida. He took a trip to Nepal. Again, this was well before the bank robbery career started. So I assume that it was being funded by his drug dealing. I can't imagine it was through the construction industry.
So as you'll recall, when Scott quit selling drugs, his stash of cash was starting to run out. This was at the same time he started obsessively watching the movie Point Break, and of course, thinking about his great uncle, Doc Scurlock, the cowboy who rode with Billy the Kid.
Apparently, Scott had talked to Mark about doing a bank robbery at some point in time, and that I'm probably familiar that Scott claimed that his ancestor, Doc Scurlock, rode Billy the Kid. He told Mark that.
What else? Did he say anything? That's a point that I actually had a investigative genetic genealogist do, kind of like just to confirm that was actually true, and she did, because I think that, and again, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but you can just see him like with a poster like on his wall of Doc Scurlock, thinking, yes, this is the prophecy. I'm the chosen one to do. I mean, it just seems like that was his psychology.
Yeah. So was that true then?
Yeah, she said it was. It was.
Oh, I had no idea. So that was, again, around March or April of 92, right before everything started. And then Scott got more serious about this, about committing a bank robbery. So that first robbery that they committed together was, June 25th, 1992, when he and Mark went to Seafirst Bank up in Madison Park. And where the makeup, Mark was wearing that Ronald Reagan mask, and Scott had some type of disguise makeup on. So that was their first robbery. So.
Can you confirm if Mark's girlfriend was a part of that robbery as the getaway car?
I can't comment on that.
Okay.
For Scott's first time, he selected a Seafirst Bank in Madison Park. Now, this is an affluent Seattle neighborhood, which A, didn't have a lot of cops patrolling the streets, and B, the nearest police station was miles away. He also purposely chose lunchtime to have a friend drop him and Scott off near the bank. Scott's larger plan involved this same friend picking them up at a predetermined rendezvous point after the heist. Now, remember, this is before cell phones, so he actually chose 2 rendezvous points just to make sure. The first one didn't work out, then they would go to the second one. That was the plan. Now, you're wondering, how would they get to these rendezvous points, either the first one or the second one? And Scott had figured that out too. Basically, before he and Mark went into the bank, they waited and watched for a customer to pull up to the bank and walk inside, and that man was their Mark. So just before they were about to leave from the robbery, they would get this guy's keys, steal his car, and then drive that stolen vehicle to the rendezvous spot. But now, as they stood in front of the bank doors, Scott was completely unrecognizable. He was wearing a homemade prosthetic nose and theatrical paint. Beside him was Mark, who wore a plastic Ronald Reagan mask. At this point, you could say they were pot committed as they pushed open the door, and Scott called out, "This is a holdup. Don't anybody move."
So when I saw Hollywood, I just equated it to makeup or mask, and I didn't really differentiate whether he had a mask on or if he had makeup on. But he didn't look like, your average person, just like before in the other bank robbery I had. I knew it was a robbery just by looking at him because he had theatrical makeup on and stuff like that.
Now, Susan wasn't there that day, but she worked as a bank customer service manager and would experience Hollywood up close and personal during his spree.
He was very stern and matter of fact. He wasn't screaming at us like some robberies I've been in, where they scream at you. No, he was very reserved and matter of fact, which you knew by his mannerisms he meant business.
What happened next was pure adrenaline. Like Vincent Vega in that famous Pulp Fiction scene when he plunges a hypodermic needle filled with adrenaline into the chest of the character played by Uma Thurman.
You're giving her an injection of adrenaline straight to her heart. All right, count to 3. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3!
The rush that coursed through Scott Scurlock's body had to have been instantaneous. The endorphins of putting everything on the line, more terrifying and exhilarating than the cliff diving he did in Hawaii, not knowing if he was going to drown from the punishing undertow after diving into the sea. Would he be able to get out of what he was starting? Robbing a bank and not getting caught. and getting away with a ton of cash. When Scott vaulted over the teller counter, he must have felt superhuman. The flood of endorphins would have heightened his senses, sharpened his focus as he shoved his gloved hand into the teller drawers, grabbing fistfuls of cash that he stuffed into his bag, all the while brandishing his Glock 9mm in a way that let bank employees know that he was more than capable and willing to use it.
He actually exercised quite a bit of self-control, which was better because I was in a different robbery where the guy was jumping around and the gun was like moving around, and that was way more unpredictable because his finger could have slipped, so he was under really good self-control.
Meantime, Mark, brandishing his own weapon and 6'3" frame, he towered above the terrified customers who'd been commanded to lie face down on the floor. Before they left the bank, Mark clocked the guy they'd seen walk in before them and demanded his car keys. Outside of the bank, Mark slid behind the wheel of their impromptu getaway car. He revved up the engine, and together they fled the bank parking lot. But by the time they got down the street to the rendezvous point to meet their real getaway vehicle, not only was their ride not there, but their stolen vehicle was having mechanical issues. Fortunately, Scott had devised that second rendezvous spot. So they abandoned the stolen vehicle and, still wearing their disguises, both Mark and Scott began running down an alley toward the second location. But as they ran near a fence, a huge dog rushed at them and ferociously started barking. Mark was traumatized. It was all just so much for him between the car and the rendezvous point not being met. And now this huge dog was so close that they could literally feel its snarling and its hot breath. And then he was shocked when he heard Scott start laughing. I can only imagine that Scott was reliving that epic foot chase scene in Point Break, when Johnny Utah is chasing after Bodhi through a residential neighborhood in LA, hopping over fences, racing through alleyways, bounding through an intricate network of homes, vaulting over gates, slamming open front and back doors. Bodhi takes the time to slide open a sliding glass door and then locks it behind him. And seconds later, Johnny Utah follows by crashing through it using the force of his own momentum and body weight. After which he's beaten with a stick by a homeowner and then continues. And when he turns a corner, all of a sudden Bodhi hurls a snarling pit bull into Johnny Utah's face. And for Mark, the nightmare wasn't over. But for Scott, neither was the excitement and the exhilaration. They still had to reach the second rendezvous point, and the two had to scale a high fence up and over into the affluent Broadmoor neighborhood, which is an exclusive gated community that is centered around a golf club. Now, they're still wearing their disguises. One of them is holding a bag of money as they run through the fairway, passing golfers on their left and their right, who basically just stood and stared with wide eyes and slack jaws. Eventually, though, Scott and Mark got to the second checkpoint where they met up with their getaway driver. They hopped into Scott's van and then drove the 45-minute commute back to Olympia and Scott's beloved treehouse where they counted out their ill-gotten gains. On that day, they'd gotten away with $20,000 cash. A starry-eyed adrenaline junkie, Scott was hooked. It was everything he dreamed about as he watched and rewatched Point Break. Now, I want to check in with psychiatrist Dr. Peter Puri. You've heard him in previous episodes. A reminder, Scott Scurlock was never a patient of his.
I can try to reverse engineer to what I know about human behavior and human psychology.
Car that they had, the getaway car that they'd taken from one of the bank customers, flooded. They flooded the engine, so they were headed out on foot. And then I guess this huge dog was barking at them and going after them. That was on this chain in Seattle. And I guess Scott started laughing. And I kind of thought, that's so weird. But then when I was watching Point Break, I saw this one of the action scenes, one of the dogs starts barking, and I guess Keanu Reeves like kicks it or something. And so I'm sure he was like thinking, oh my gosh, this is it.
Yeah, totally.
Right?
I mean, it's exactly like, this is exactly my fantasy. I get to be living it right now.
After the robbery, his accomplice, Mark Biggins, stood up to Scott. He told him he was done with robbing banks. The experience had been so awful for him, he never wanted to do it again. But for Scott Scurlock, this heist was just the beginning. Point Break screenwriter W. Peter Iliff.
You might be amused by this. The chase scenes were so frenetic in Point Break, and that action and adrenaline energy. And in one of the scenes, Keanu Reeves is being attacked by a dog and then kicks it or something. Well, okay, so as I was getting more into the Hollywood case, I read somewhere that he had been on their very first bank robbery. He and his accomplice like made a comedy of errors, and his accomplice was like, oh my gosh, this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I never want to do this. They're running, they're being chased by this dog. And as they're being chased and this dog is like massively growling at them, all of a sudden Hollywood starts laughing. And his friend was like, or accomplice was like, why is he laughing? Like he's enjoying this. And then I put two and two together and I was like, oh my gosh, he's living his fantasy. And that's what I talked with Paul about. He agreed that that's why he was laughing, because in his mind, I mean, we can speculate that it's his fantasy, this adrenaline rush coming through, even down to the dog scene. And so it's kind of like another one of those kind of ironic moments when you look at him being inspired by the movie, and then it's kind of, his vision coming to life. That adrenaline thing, that adrenaline rush. I think he kept on having to rob banks because he kept wanting to get that dopamine hit.
Yeah, that's got to be a trip to do that. I mean, you gotta like suck it up and walk in there and control that room. And I think obviously I've never done it, but I talked to a lot of law enforcement guys, and they said like that's what you got to do. Like it's peace through superior firepower. Just scare them into submission so nobody gets hurt. And if you come in weak, they're going to prey on weakness and something's going to go bad.
Here's retired Seattle police detective Mike McGann.
With all due respect to him, I mean, this is why I say he was a true professional. He tried to emulate Point Break.
Oh, big time.
But he fucked that up. And I mean...
How do you mean?
Well, I mean wearing masks and carjacking people and the cars breaking down and, running through golf courses. And I mean, just every the way it...
You're talking about the first one.
Yeah, the first robbery. And you got to remember something. It's like an investment. High risk, low return. Okay.
Big time.
It was huge. And when you're walking out the door with just a couple $100 or you're dropping the money or different things, you have to stop. And usually you would see these guys, there would be a progression. They were building up to something. And I mean, if you really looked at a good case, he was the type of guy that started off as a rank amateur that probably talked to a couple of his buddies and they thought they could do what Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze, excuse me.
Bodie.
So Patrick Swayze, that what they were doing, they could surf all day, play basketball, and then, meet Johnny Utah and put on a mask and go do a robbery and walk away with thousands and go back out and play basketball and surf and do all this different shit. It isn't like that. It isn't like that at all. I mean, the average bank robber back then was getting, when you went to one teller station, you'd pass a note, maybe $800, $1,500. But if you saw somebody go in and take a whole teller line, there could be a bunch of money. Or if you got to the vault, there could be, a huge amount of money.
Scott vowed to be better next time, and there would most certainly be a next time.
He went through that phase of, copying Point Break, reinvested in himself, and became this guy that, reconstructed his face, various putty and makeup, things like that, reconstructed the bone structure on the face and the cheek structure and the eyebrows and did eyebrows, wore a wig, and, really became this other person. Had a wig, had two-way communications, had an earpiece with a walkie-talkie or a two-way radio on his belt, using, at that time, Glock was really the gun of choice that had come out, and he was using what we could tell was a Glock 9mm handgun. And so he wore, in a lot of the robberies, he wore a very signature shoe that's very popular today, is the Converse high-top tennis shoe, the Chuck Taylors. And that was kind of his signature shoe. In other robberies, he wore some other like Rockport shoes. But he had again, that what we talked about, that how you look, he had that look, and that was his signature, that he would always look the same in these robberies with his face. And with all that makeup and the putty and the overlays and everything on, we couldn't have told who he was. There would have been no way in hell to figure out that you put that mask on and then you get his face. In the end, it looked like two different people.
Next time on part 6 of Hollywood, The Ritual.
Well, and you brought up a really great point, the ritual, that I didn't think about. He had this underground bunker in his in one of the barn things on his property, and that's where he had his makeup and his like prosthetics, and that's where he went to count the money. And in there he had a stereo system in there, and the DVD or disc or whatever tech was at the time was playing the theme song to Top Gun. So I could see him like prepping for this, like, press play.
Highway to the Danger Zone there. Yeah.
That's his soundtrack.
Yeah.
And one of the other soundtracks they found was Thelma and Louise. And so I can only think that that ritual of putting on the makeup, of preparing, but he had to wear those Converse that he was known for. It just feels like he had to. There was something going on there where it's like, why would you wear shoes that everybody knows you wear?
Yeah, that's a little wink. That's a little like wink. Will somebody pick up on this? Because who's looking at the shoes when someone's running around necessarily? Grainy old, security cameras.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Brandon Morgan and I will discuss the case in more detail. Also, check us out on our Criminal Mischief YouTube channel at EVO Creative. That's EVIO Creative. And look for us on our social media channels. We'd love to chat with you. And as always, thanks for listening. From Pie in the Sky Media, Criminal Mischief is an EVO production, recorded live in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Brandon Morgan and myself. Music by Soundstripe. For EVO Creative, I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.